Welcome into another episode of Running for the Roses. I'm Ryan Bafaloukos, joined by my partner in crime, Lucas Rohde. Lucas, a couple days away now from Memorial Day. How are you, my friend? How's life in Nashville?
It's very, very good. Excited for the long weekend ahead. The weather here has been honestly beautiful the last 2 or 3 weeks. Starting to feel like summer, but it is crazy. I think a week or 3 months from tomorrow we have week zero. So we're about 90 days away from college football, which is crazy. Enjoy the summer. I love the
Yeah.
summer. It's arguably my favorite season, but it is hard to believe that college football is really not that far away.
It truly feels like college football is one of those sports now where there's just no off season.
Mm-mm.
Like there's so much news like week to week, whether it's coaching, whether it's NIL, recruiting, realignment, Big Ten commissioners going rogue and signing away title games, which we'll get to in a few minutes that they weren't supposed to. Like it's like the NBA. It's like in the office when they had the sign of like it's been 0 days since our last nonsense. Like that's what college football is. It's kind of like a circus in the offseason, and I just love it. I'm just here for it.
Yeah, no, it's very true. It's just we're getting kind of like the NFL where there's playing season and then non-playing season. There is really no such thing. But it's great for us because it gives us ample stuff to talk about all year,
Right.
which is amazing.
Yeah. All right. On this week's on this episode of Running for the Roses, Lucas and I are going to chat and go over Pete Thamel's article about the Big Ten TV. Some interesting situations there in the Big Ten with a television contract. Kevin Warren, the former commissioner, promising some things that he probably couldn't have promised and probably shouldn't have promised. And then Lucas and I are going to dive into some non-conference stuff. We're going to go through our best non-conference matchups of the 2023 season, and then we're going to go over which teams have the easiest and most challenging non-conference schedules, which I think is pretty useful information. Like I was thinking about betting, right? Like if you're looking at over and under
Hmm.
with win totals, which we'll get to here shortly, like in the next couple months, you're going to want to know like which teams don't have a Power Five team on their non-conference schedule, which teams have two. Like I think that's pretty useful information. So, but before we get to that, we're going to jump into some news here that Pete Thamel from ESPN reported last week. He had a really descriptive, really in-depth article on ESPN. I encourage everyone to go out and read it about an interesting situation in the Big Ten Conference. Obviously, the Big Ten starting a new major television deal with NBC, starting a new deal with CBS. CBS obviously losing the SEC in 2024. That's when the CBS big money from the Big Ten will start. But we get some games on CBS for the Big Ten this year. But it seems like the Big Ten situation not really settled. Here's from the article a couple key points from ESPN.com. Schools have recently found out they're going to have to pay back nearly $40 million to Fox because Kevin Warren delivered NBC the Big Ten football championship game in 2026 without the full authority to do so. Schools are going to have to pay back $25 million total for a deal to pay Fox back for lost 2020 football inventory. And then how about this? This is, I think, the most intriguing part of it. Tens of millions of dollars of value in the NBC primetime deal is in flux as new Big Ten Commissioner Tom Petiti has been racing to ensure it keeps much of the original value as possible. Historically, the Big Ten, after the first weekend in November, schools were not required to play night games for a lot of reasons: health, recovery, campus logistics, among them. Lucas, as you might know, NBC paid for a primetime
Hmm.
7:30 Eastern slate, and I don't think they're too pleased to be getting like Illinois, Indiana in the middle of November. You're a resident Big Ten expert. You're the Wisconsin Badger alum. What are your thoughts reading this as we're, like you said, 90 days away from the college football season and seemingly a lot in flux with that television deal?
I'm just surprised we didn't hear about this stuff earlier. I mean, NBC's already the last 2 months has been doing Saturday night Big Ten promos, like
Yeah.
on commercials. They even put out casting calls at Big Ten universities asking students to show up to be in these promos. And my thing, it just shows kind of the lack of, I guess, leadership or trust in leadership that they had in Kevin Warren. We all kind of knew that even if Kevin Warren hadn't left for the NFL, there was a real there was a very good chance that the Big Ten chancellors and presidents were not even going to extend past his current contract, and a lot of it was he wasn't very transparent with them, lacked a lot of communication. It wasn't just them. In that article too, like coaches like Tom Izzo, for example, were really really upset that they were not uh, consulted at all on this deal. They were not happy that a good chunk of Big Ten basketball games this year are going to go on to streaming. Same with a few football games. But to me, it's just, did these presidents and chancellors just not, did they not read the contracts though too, or see them?
Right.
When they saw these promos, they knew that there was going to be prime time NBC Saturday night games. Did they think, were they that naive to think, well, they're probably not going to want the last 3 weeks, the biggest weeks of college football, to play night games? Oh, and by the way, I'm sure they don't expect our top brands to play those games either, because we told them that we're not going to play night games. As I mean, Penn State, Michigan, uh, and I believe in Ohio State,
Ohio State. Yeah.
basically have an unwritten agreement pretty much with the Big Ten saying that they will not play late November night games. And there's a lot to do that. They used to be just flat out banned. Now you need permission by both schools, but it's just a mess. The thing is, though, it's not going to fall through. Um, there's too much money on the table, and we're already seeing Big Ten teams make concessions. Ohio State's going to play a night game November 11th against Michigan State, and then we just saw yesterday Michigan State is going to host Penn State in a Black Friday night game. However, they're going to be playing it in Ford Field in Detroit, which is like a 3 or 4 hour drive from East Lansing. So people are making do. My thing is, there's still, after this season, there's still 6 more years on this contract, and the NBC thing is not going to go away. So, are more Big Ten teams just going to make concessions, which I'm assuming they're going to have to? It was just kind of a cluster from the top to the bottom. I think, yes, Kevin Warren to blame. The fact that he knew he couldn't sell the Big Ten title game and just did it anyway. Just, I think you're just kind of like, what the heck? But then also, like I said, on the side with the Big Ten chancellors and presidents, hey, you wanted the biggest TV deal ever for a college conference. These are the type of concessions you're going to have to make if you want top dollar. Everyone's going to be playing Saturday night primetime games in November. The SEC, the ACC, the Big Ten, or the Big 12, the Pac 12. They're all going to be doing this, I think. And it's kind of hypocritical. They're going to say, we can't play them in November, but yet you're going to retrofit your stadiums to hopefully host a playoff game later in the year in December. I think it all gets worked out. I texted our buddy Josh, who obviously has a close affinity with USC, and asked him what he thought about it. And he honestly was just like, hey, it's this is first world problems in college football. Basically, he's like, I'd still deal with this than the amount of other problems that infiltrate the Pac-12. So in the grand scheme of things, I don't think it's a big deal, but I think everyone is happy Kevin Warren is probably not gone, or is now gone, and you brought in a guy like Tony Petitti, who has just a huge resume in this field.
Right.
It'll work out, but yeah, it's definitely not something you want to happen 3 months before you're about to start the season.
Yeah, the not playing night games was baffling to me. I had never heard of that stipulation or that unwritten agreement. Again, I'm out in Arizona. I don't really know a ton about the interworkings of the Big Ten Conference. Like, I remember in 2021, Michigan State and Penn State played it, like, I think it was a 3:30 Eastern game. It's bled in 7, 8 o'clock Eastern. It was freezing. They seemed to play the game just fine. Like, it's baffling to me that, like you said, you're going to potentially host on-campus playoff games as early as next season in December, and yet you don't want to play a night game. And the other thing is, all of these fan bases and teams complain that they're always on big noon kickoff, right? Like, don't all these fan bases just say, like, why are the games always at noon? We want to play later. And now you're like, well, you have 7:30 now. They're like, no, actually. And it's like every team in America wants to play at 3:30 Eastern.
Mm-hmm.
Like, every team wants the 3:30 time slot. It's the perfect time slot because you have a ton of time to tailgate, but it's not too cold or, whatever. You have time after the game. Yeah, it's pretty crazy to me that this is not settled. I mean, usually these TV deals get announced years in
Hmm.
advance, right? So you have time to work out the little logistics. And the fact that we're here less than 100 days to the start of the season, NBC has week 1, it's West Virginia against Penn State. They've announced several, like you said, Ohio State, Michigan State in November, and then Michigan State hosting Penn State at Ford Field on Black Friday. One of 2 Black Friday games, Iowa, Nebraska, the other one also on NBC. Interesting to see how it will shake out. Interesting to see. I mean, Lucas and I are just nerds for this. Like we love where's the game going to be on television, what channel, and what draft is going to, and we're going to talk non-conference games here shortly. But yeah, I mean, you would think coaches would be on board for like night games, get the fans liquored up, great atmosphere, Penn State whiteout, like whatever. They'd be on board for
Hmm.
this, right? And Pac-12 coaches have complained about this for years, right? Like we hate playing these games at 7:30, 8 o'clock because if we're on the road, we don't get back to campus till 3, 4 in the morning on Sunday. It's tough for our players. But I mean, this is what college football is now. It's a business.
Hmm.
You know, uh, the notion that these conferences are going to do what's best for fans or athletes or coaches is just not the case. They're going to do what's best for their pockets,
Hmm.
and that's what you signed up for, unfortunately. So
Yeah,
we'll see.
and I think that the Pac-12 thing is funny because I do think starting next year, part of this problem is helped because I just can see them putting USC and UCLA as one
Yeah.
for sure 7:30 or 8:30 night games on NBC every year, because they obviously don't have the
Well, here's the other thing, though, right? From what I understand, NBC gets third pick every week, right? In
it.
the TV deal, because Fox has one. I know that. Like
Yes,
Fox has their choice, and I thought CBS had the second game. Maybe I'm
I think they
mistaken.
flip. I think them
Okay.
and CBS switch off.
Right.
It's obviously it's different this year because CBS they're only getting 7 games this year because they are still contractually obligated to have an SEC game on at
Yeah.
3:30. But next year, I think it flips, but I could be wrong. I don't know. That stuff is I find that stuff incredibly interesting, but I have no idea how it all works.
My point is you have 6 to 8 really true elite brands in that conference when USC, UCLA come in, Ohio State, Michigan, Wisconsin, Penn State, whatever. You only have 4 dates to fill,
Hmm.
4 of those night games in November every year. We know USC is probably going to get one, right? Like maybe Ohio State and Michigan alternate years they get one. Penn State, Wisconsin alternate years they get one. Maybe like Minnesota or Iowa or another team has a really nice 4 or 5 year run. They take like it. I don't think it's going to be a huge deal. I think you're going to see the big brands play like every other year a 7:30 game on NBC.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but really good reporting from Pete Thamel. Really good and interesting article.
Mhm.
Anything else on that before we move on?
No, just to kind of your point. Like, there's just way too much money on the table. Like, I think NBC's paying like $380 million a year for this package, so they'll make it work.
Yeah.
I did think it was funny that they did have to pay Fox back for the Big Ten title game, but
40 million. That's not chump
no,
change.
and
That's like 3 to 4 million a school. I don't know how that money gets paid back. Like, I don't know how when the schools get their money, when they don't, like, does that come from like the Big Ten fund, or are they going to like, is Tony Petitti like calling up like the Rutgers AD being like, hey, I need that $3.8 million back. I know you probably sent it on like women's swimming, but we need it back.
that second waterfall you put in the football locker
Yeah,
room. Just we're gonna have to
yeah,
sell that. We're gonna have to sell that, but.
yeah.
I w-
Put that up on eBay.
I will say one point, and then we can move on, that I did find interesting was the reason why they had to pay Fox back is so the Big Ten, I guess, doesn't technically own their TV rights. The Big Ten network apparently owns since 2016 owns all the games, and then they just license them out to these other networks, and the Big Ten network is
Which
owned
is
by
wild.
Fox.
Which is
So
wild.
yeah,
It's wild to me.
so that is why Fox was basically negotiating all these deals for the Big Ten because they technically owned all of this property, which that I did not know, and that is bonkers to me. If we didn't think these networks were too intertwined with these conferences, well, they literally are. Like Fox literally owns the Big Ten for football, pretty much.
Yeah, that was so interesting to read that. They were they were like they're like, yeah, Fox executives are sitting in as Big Ten is negotiating with NBC. You're like, this is weird.
Right.
This is weird. Yeah, more to come on that. We'll see how that. We'll see. I'm guessing there will be news over the summer that breaks that we can talk about as well. All right, let's get to some on the field stuff here. Non-conference games. I texted Lucas. I said, let's each give our top 8 non-conference games that we're most looking forward to. Could be most intriguing. Doesn't have to be big brand versus big brand. Doesn't have to be Power Five versus Power Five. Games that you're most intrigued by, that you're most looking forward to coming into the 2023 season. Lucas, I would say on average, this is probably an average year for non-conference games. Like, we don't have a true like top 5 headliner, right? Like, I think 2 years ago we had Georgia Clemson in Charlotte, which was like 2 top 5 teams in the country. Like, there's not one of those, but I think it's a pretty deep and solid slate. Before we go into our top 8, I'm going to give my 3 honorable mentions. So these were just missing the cut for me. The first one I want to talk about is Pitt at West Virginia,
Mm-hmm.
backyard brawl. I love that these two teams are continuing on this rivalry, and I think as we get more into realignment, we get more into this could have been a blueprint for Texas and Texas A&M, right? Like, every 5 years, play twice, right? Play a home and home, something like that. So, Pitt goes at West Virginia this year. West Virginia we'll get to later. They have 2 pretty interesting non conference games as well. My other 2 honorable mentions: Utah at Baylor. Utah at Baylor week 2. Utah plays Florida week 1. I'll talk about that game here in a little bit. And then they go to Baylor week 2. We'll see what Utah looks like. That could be a statement game for them on the road. Baylor, year 4 under Dave Aranda, down year last year after a Big 12 championship. Kind of Baylor's first true test against the reigning Pac-12 champion. And then one near and dear to Lucas Rohde's heart, Wisconsin at Washington State.
Mm.
Um, First real test for Luke Fickell. Washington State beat Wisconsin in Camp Randall last year. That was kind of the game where everyone's ears perked up a little bit. I think that was a week or 2 before Illinois,
Yeah.
and that was like, oh, what? How, wait a second. What's going on there over there at with the Badgers? And so Washington State gets a return game. Badgers go up there. First real test for Luke Fickell. Cam Ward, really, really good for Washington State. Should be a fun one there. Lucas, any thoughts on those 3 games here before we get, or any honorable mentions you might have had?
Yeah. So, one, I almost put in the one that you had, the um, Utah at Baylor. You mentioned, that's going to be coming off is that literally after Florida plays or Utah plays
Yeah,
against
Utah has
Florida?
Florida on Thursday, August 31st. So week 1, but Thursday, and then at Baylor on the following Saturday.
That's brutal, considering that they also have to play a full
Yeah.
9-game Pac-12
Yeah.
schedule. I think one thing that is intriguing with some of these in the Pac-12, because I had a few of them, of some of these non-conference games. I just think if you're in the Pac-12, you can, if you want to qualify for the college football playoff, you cannot lose one of these non-conference games, because I just don't see any Pac-12 team going undefeated in conference play, just because it's a really, really good league this year. So
Yeah.
the fact that Utah has 2 Power 5 non-conference games, though I think you could make an argument they might be favored in both of them, I think is really, really intriguing. I was going to say a couple honorable mentions I had. I had North Carolina versus South Carolina. I believe that's a neutral site game in Charlotte. I think both 2 intriguing teams. Both come in, obviously North Carolina has arguably one of the best quarterbacks in the country with Drake May. What are they going to look like with Phil Longo? Last year was somewhat of a bounce back year. They made it to the ACC title game. And then I think South Carolina is a team that's coming in with obviously a lot of hype on how they ended last year, knocking off both Tennessee and Clemson in back-to-back weeks, and then winning, going 8-5. Shane Beamer has them recruiting at a really, really high level. I think that's one of those games that basically I don't see any of these 2 teams going to the college football playoff, but winning this game could make the difference between you being a 7-8 win team or an 8 or a 9-10 win team. And it should be a fun atmosphere there in Charlotte. Another honorable mention, just because I think every game for the first time ever, I think every game that Iowa plays is going to be entertaining because it's the race to 325. So I had honorable mention Iowa State. I think one of the more underrated non-conference rivalries in college football. Last year, Matt Campbell beat Iowa for the first time since he took over at Iowa State. Um, and that was really maybe their biggest moment last year. It was a down
Oh
season
yeah,
for Matt Campbell,
for
only
sure.
4-8. I'm interested to see how they look if they can bounce back. And then with Iowa, I think we know what they're going to do, but like it's going to be the real first test to see, if Cade McNamara, Eric All, they recently just brought in Caleb Bryant from Ohio State as a transfer to see if that offense is any different or is at least somewhat better. I think it's that real tough test. So those were a couple of my honorable mentions that I
Yeah,
was thinking about.
I had I had South Carolina, North Carolina number 8 on my
Mm.
list. So we're kind of similar thinking. I really like that game. It's one of the better non-conference quarterback matchups. I think, um, in past years that opening weekend, like the eventual Heisman Trophy winner has used like a big week 1 game on like
Mm-hmm.
a national spotlight to like jumpstart the Heisman campaign. You look at Drake May, that could be it right there, right? I know he's got a new offensive coordinator, but you have a big game where you throw for 400, 500 yards, you throw for 3, 4 touchdowns, you put up 45, and you beat South Carolina. Like that's a game might be on ABC prime time. Regardless, it's going to be one of the bigger Week 1 games. Like that's a game that could propel you into a Heisman Trophy conversation. Really good quarterback matchup with him and Spencer Rattler, and like you said, two teams that have some helium here, right? Like they two teams on the rise. And we'll see what in Charlotte, and neutral site game. I think both fan bases will travel well, so yeah, that'll be a fun one. I have that one number 8 on my list. So, all right, Lucas, I'm gonna let's go top to bottom here.
Mm-hmm.
Number 1, your most intriguing non-conference game of 2023 is.
I think this was like an easy one. I think it's the top of probably most people's lists. It was a game that was played last year.
Yep.
And I think Texas at Alabama is the most intriguing. You might say, hey, that's not a rare find or anything like that. But I, I think it's intriguing for both sides. One, this was a game Texas probably should have won last year if Bryce Young isn't amazing in that 2-minute drive to end the game. Um, Texas is probably having their biggest win in program history in like a decade. Um, and Texas should be loaded this year. We talked about the improvement that Quinn Ewers looks to have made during the spring game, but they're also returning guys like Jordan Whittington, Xavier Worthy, Jatavion Sanders. That offensive line should be a lot better. We're expecting that defense to take a step up. And look, talent's never been an issue for Texas, and they should line up really, really well with Alabama. And look, it can Alabama stave off another down, what we consider for them a down season. They had only missed the playoff, I think, for only like the second time in the Saban era. The last time they did that, the next year they won the national title game with Mac Jones. So I think but with Alabama's quarterback situation, we have no idea if it's going to be Jalen Monroe. We have no idea if it's going to be Tyler Buckner. Um, I think Alabama can get away with average quarterback play. We've seen it in their history. If you have amazing talent everywhere else, you can usually get by. But this is going to be a big game because we saw before Quinn Ewers got hurt in that game last year, he was balling. I mean, he was dicing Alabama up. And so I'm interested if this game were to get into a shootout, will Alabama be able to have enough firepower at quarterback to kind of compete with that? It is crazy how now, like all of a sudden, Texas, we're like, can Alabama hold up against Texas? It's a really weird dichotomy that we see ourselves in heading into this game.
Yeah, I have that game number 1 as well. To me, there's 2 clear choices for the top 2. We'll get to my number 2 here in a second. But you're right. For all the reasons you said, this is the most intriguing game. It's week 2, so both teams will get kind of a tune-up game. Week 1, Texas has Rice. I forget who Alabama plays. This is going to be the is Texas back game. right? This is a great chance for Texas to go into Tuscaloosa. Night game. It's going to be a 7 o'clock Eastern game on ESPN. They already announced it. And you're right. Like, they have firepower. You have Quinn Ewers, who was up and down last year, had a really good spring, kind of held off Arch Manning, and will be the starting quarterback. It could go really good, and they could put up 40 points in Alabama and get a huge win on the road and catapult Texas to the top of the Big 12 and the top of kind of everyone's minds, right? Steve Sarkisian's third year. I think on our last episode we talked about coaches on the hot seat. Like, this is a big year for Sark, right? This could be you win the Big 12 and contend for the college football playoff, or the wheels fall off, things go sideways, and you're fired in November. Like, that's the ceiling and the floor for Texas this year, right? Like, so week 2 in Tuscaloosa is going to set the tone. And for Alabama, you're right. Like, a down year for them is going to the Sugar Bowl. But they haven't won a national championship since the COVID year in 2020. You have uncertainty at quarterback. You have uncertainty at wide receiver. You lose Jameer Gibbs. We've talked about Alabama a lot the last couple of weeks, right? Probably not going to be the preseason favorite in the SEC West this year, right? That's probably going to be LSU. So Alabama could also make a statement. You go out there, you beat Texas like 42-10, and everyone's like, why do we underrate Alabama, right? We'll talk about it on the pod the next week. Why do we sleep on Alabama? So for that reason, it's the clear number one. It's two of the top 5, 6 biggest brands in the sport. It's actually a home game. Like, it's a home game in Tuscaloosa at Bryant Denny. It's going to be really exciting. One of the biggest games of the season, regardless of conference, non-conference. So, all right, number 2 for me, again, a game that was played last year. This is a neutral site game. I have Florida State and LSU, number 2. Two of the preseason hype teams, like two of the teams that are going to be hyped in July and August in the preview magazines in the top 25. I think these will probably be 2 top 10 teams, 2 top 12, 15 teams. LSU ended the season really strong. Lost to Texas A&M aside. They win the SEC West in Brian Kelly's first year. They slaughter Purdue in their bowl game. They get to 10 wins. They beat Alabama. Florida State, same thing, right? You started 4-0, you lost 3 straight, but you end the season really, really strong. You get to 10 wins. You beat Oklahoma in the bowl game. You have Jordan Travis back. They've loaded up in the transfer portal. They got another strong wide receiver transfer commit this past week as well. Keon Coleman from Michigan State. Florida State might be the preseason favorite in the ACC. It's them and Clemson, and LSU is alongside Georgia, one of the preseason favorites in the SEC. So they're doing this game, unfortunately, in Orlando. They did last year's game in New Orleans. And Lucas, do you remember last year's game? Like, it was nuts. Like, Florida State jumped out big. LSU had tied the game. They blew the extra point. Like, it was chaos. Everyone's getting ready to fire Brian Kelly one game into his tenure at LSU. And so I think for that, like, the team that wins soar. Like, they will take off, right? With the polls, with the national conversation. Team that loses, it's a non-conference game, no harm, no foul. I like it when teams take on these challenges, but I have Florida State and LSU as my second most intriguing non-conference game.
Yeah, that was my number 2 as well, for some of the reasons you had mentioned, but also I just find it interesting that they're like the parallels for both these two programs are oddly familiar. They were very familiar with each other last year. Like, it was 2 teams, obviously a big time helmet game, but we had no idea what the hell the expectations were for either of these programs last year. LSU was in their first year under Brian Kelly. Obviously, Mike Norvell was in his third year, but we thought a success was probably 7-5, 8-4 if they can get to a bowl game. And now both those teams last year completely succeeded their expectations. And now both of them come in this year, as you mentioned, probably both dark horses to win their respective conferences this season too. Both have experienced guys coming back at the quarterback position, like Jordan Travis for Florida State, Jalen Daniels at LSU. I'm excited to watch guys like Jared Verse, who last year we had no idea how good he was going to be, coming from the University of Albany. Could have gone to the NFL draft. And then, seeing guys like Mason Smith come back. He got hurt in that game last year for LSU. one of the premier defensive players in the country, as well as Harold Perkins, who was maybe the best defensive freshman last year. So there's a lot of star power where last year was kind of a little bit of an unknown, and it's kind of crazy how both those teams, and I completely agree. Like it's going to set the tone for the rest of their season. Whoever wins this game is going to be the darling of Week 1. I think, regardless, we're going to do our Week 1 overreaction shows, and I'm telling you right now, one of them's going to be Florida. Whoever wins this game is winning the national championship because everyone's
Yep.
going to be so hyped about it. So yeah, that was my number 2, especially because whichever one wins, that's such a big win for even if you don't win your conference, that's still a huge win to put on your resume for potentially maybe one of these leagues to try to get 2 teams in this coming year.
So I think now there's going to be some variance here. I will let you go first with your number 3 pick, but I think those are the clear top 2, and I think now we get some variance. So let me hear it. Your third most intriguing game in the non-conference.
I am gonna go. So I kind of my 3 through like 8. I think I could probably switch them up to any order, and I'd
Sure.
be okay. So I'm gonna go with one that I think you might chuckle a little bit. And I'm gonna go with Texas A&M versus Miami because
They're on my list.
the
I think it was 5 on my list. So go ahead.
so this game, if you watched this game last year, God bless you, this game stunk last year. Like it was,
It was so bad.
we didn't know how
So bad.
bad both of these teams were, but the fact when you look back at it now, A&M only scored 17 points. I think the next week Miami lost. I think the next week was they lost to and gave up 45 points to Middle Tennessee State. So that shows you how bad the offense was for A&M. And then Miami, the fact that they lost by 8 points on the road to a pretty bad A&M team. Look, it just stunk. But honestly, it's a fresh start for both of these coaches. But neither one of these coaches, especially Jimbo, can afford to have a bad start to this season. I don't think Cristobal is going to get fired if they go 5-7 again, but neither can afford a bad year. And both will have new offensive coordinators to kind of shake things up. Interested to see what A&M looks like under Bobby Petrino and who the hell is going to be calling plays for them. We probably won't know even as the season goes on. But I just think the narratives, there's going to be like 20,000 people at Hard Rock Stadium watching this game, half of which will probably be A&M fans. So,
Right.
but I do think it is interesting because even though both these teams struggled, this is going to be a circle game for both of them. Be like, hey, if we win this game, we get our season back on track. We turn around the narrative. We're not going to have a down year. So that's why it's mine. It's more just the intriguing storylines on there because both these teams should be better, at least talent wise, than what they were a year ago.
Yeah, both these teams need to be better,
Yeah.
right? Both these teams didn't make bowl games, last year. Like Texas A&M brings in the number 1 overall class in history, right, in the internet recruiting era, and they don't make a bowl game, right? They go 5-7. I had this at number 5 on my list, but like you said, intriguing storylines. It's week 2. It's a return game, 17-9. A&M won in College Station last year. Hopefully, you bet the under. Texas A&M unders became a thing.
Yeah.
For us last year, betting wise. Yeah, I mean, it's a huge storyline game, right? It's going to be week 2, so again, each team gets kind of a tune-up game, right? You kind of get your FCS opponent or you get your G5 opponent out of the way. And for Jimbo, this will be the first test for the kind of revamped offense. Mario Cristobal, same thing, right? He's got 2 new coordinators. Jimbo has a new offensive coordinator. Tyler Van Dyke, year 3 at Miami, right? Remember we had the Tyler Van Dyke to Alabama smoke.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what does that look like? What does the offense look like, right? You don't have Josh Gaddis anymore. If Texas A&M loses this game, the seat for Jimbo Fisher will get scorching hot. Like you will start to see the rumblings of like, what's the cost of crude oil now? Is it up 4%? Uh-oh, Jimbo. Like you'll start to see those kind of rumblings. And if I listen, we've talked about like we both think Cristobal. I don't think he gets fired this year. They've invested too much money in him in that program. I think he does want to build it the right way. Gets his first full recruiting class in, which was like pretty good, right? Especially along the offensive and the defensive lines. So I don't think it means as much for Miami, but if you're Miami, like you said, we joked about it. What does the crowd look like? Can you get a good crowd? It's not going to be a night game, I don't think, because it's the same week as Alabama and Texas, which
Mhm.
gets the 7 o'clock Eastern ESPN game. So my guess is it'll be a 3:30 game on ABC or ESPN or something. Like, what does the crowd look like? What's the energy? What's the vibe? Could be a good recruiting weekend for Miami. So yep, I had it number 5 on my list. I certainly think intriguing storylines in that game, and if A&M goes down, it will be a great week for the pod as far as content goes. It'll be a great week. Last year was Scott Frost, right?
Yeah.
When are they going to fire Scott Frost? When are they going? This year it's Jimbo. Like
Hmm.
I think Jimbo enters the season on the hottest seat. And every game will be magnified. Watch them lose their week 1 game. I don't even know who they play. Watch them like lose to the FCS or the G5 opponent week 1.
Ooh, they play New Mexico.
Oh,
Hey,
Danny Gonzalez.
New Mexico is trying to play for a dark horse Pac-12 Pac-12
Mid.
invite. That's They'll beat Texas A&M, and then they're going to have columns coming out of Albuquerque saying, "See, we could take down the SEC." But no, they
All
play.
right, go ahead.
I will say they play New Mexico, and another intriguing game just because of the names. We have the Battle of Miami's in week 1. We have Miami of Ohio playing Miami,
Ooh,
Florida. So interesting.
interesting.
Never seen that before.
Interesting. If Miami, Florida loses, they have to go live a week in Miami, Ohio. They get to switch. They get to switch for a week. All right, my number 3 game in the non-conference is Ohio State at Notre Dame. Week 4, a return game. Notre Dame went to Columbus and really put up a heck of a fight. That was a game that pretty sure I bet Ohio State
Hmm.
and like took the spread last year because I did not think Notre Dame would be able to handle it. I remember the Notre Dame defense playing well. Marcus Freeman's first game playing against CJ Stroud. Ohio State got the win this year. Buckeyes travel to South Bend. Really like one of the more intriguing. We don't see Ohio State do this a lot, is what I'm trying to get at, I guess, right? Like, I think they had a home and home with Oklahoma, like in the mid 2010s, but Ohio State going on the road, true game. It's going to be a really good crowd in South Bend. This will be the first real opportunity for the new Ohio State quarterback, whether it's Kyle McCord or Devin Brown. Uh, Notre Dame with Sam Hartman. I know they have a week 0 game against Navy. I don't remember their early season schedule, but this will be it's again 2 huge brands, and that's why I put it 3. I think it's less about the storylines for me. It's more about Ohio State, Notre Dame, under the lights, NBC, like 2 huge brands, and we've talked about
Hmm.
before. Big year for Ryan Day,
Hmm.
right? You've gone back to back years losing to Michigan, back to back years not winning the Big Ten West, back to back years not winning the conference. That's what you're paid to do at Ohio State. So, um, big kind of first test for Ohio State, and should be a really fun one there in South Bend.
Yeah, I agree, and it's hard to believe. I mean, just the proximity, between Ohio and Indiana. This is only going to be the 8th ever meeting between Ohio State and Notre Dame. So, like you were just saying, that these type of games don't happen very often. Should be an amazing crowd in South Bend. Interesting to see what Notre Dame's offense looks like with Sam Hartman. If they're able to improve what was the 92nd ranked passing attack in FBS last year. um, I think they benefit that. I believe this, like you mentioned, this will be Notre Dame's 4th game. I know they play Navy. I think they play Tennessee State and then another G5 team. I know they play NC State, which will be a decent test for them before playing Ohio State as well. So you can look that, hey, that gives them 3 games to get in sync. On the other hand, you're going to give Ohio State a couple games to potentially get in sync as well. So um, I think it'll be like you said, raucous atmosphere. And for Notre Dame, you mentioned it's a big year for Ryan Day. This is a huge year for Marcus Freeman too. They did not start off the year particularly well last season, with losses to Marshall and then to Stanford before they really got things kind of going there towards the end. And we talked about kind of some spring storylines with them too. How they ended, the recruiting trail. They had a good recruiting class, but it could have been a lot better had they had hung on to a few guys. This, if they want to be kind of the recruiting power that I think some of the fans think Notre Dame should be, these are the type of games you have to win at home against a helmet school, against a team that is going to be competing for a national title this year. Because, like you said, you don't get these opportunities very, very often. And obviously, Marcus Freeman, being a former Ohio State Buckeye himself, like, sure, there's some personal feelings towards this game too. So, yeah, intriguing on both the coaching aspects. And one, I think that's September 23rd. So it's a later game in the non-conference. Will easily be probably arguably the biggest game maybe that weekend, depending on how those teams start off the season.
All right, next up for you, number 4 for you.
Ooh, so this is special for me. So 4 was Ohio State at Notre Dame. So I'll go to my number 5, and that is, we were talking about Group of 5. This is our Group of 5 in 5 or whatever. But I got
love it. Here we go.
Even though only half of it's Group of 5, but I have Tulane versus Ole Miss.
Yep.
I think Tulane last year, obviously, great story. The way that they've been able to rebuild that program, and not only did they beat Kansas State last year, who was the eventual Big 12 champs. They beat them on the road, and then they beat USC in the Cotton Bowl last year, and then also won the American Conference in between. Michael Pratt is back at quarterback, and they get an SEC opponent on the schedule. And that happens to be Ole Miss. Not sure what the expectations are for Ole Miss this year. Have no idea who's going to play quarterback, whether that's going to be Spencer Sanders, if it's going to continue to be Jackson Dart, which it looked like out of the spring. A lot of options there for Lane Kiffin. I just think offensively, this is going to be a very, very fun football game. And for Tulane, if they want any shot at maybe potentially pulling to Cincinnati, this is a game that they arguably have to win. So I think it's just going to be fun, especially for Tulane. This will probably be some primetime game, whether that's a 2:30 or a 7:30 game. I think it's a good spotlight for how Tulane. They just opened a new stadium down there in New Orleans too. I think it'll be a lot of fun.
Yeah, you look at how Ole Miss ended last season. They lost 4 straight, including their bowl game to Texas Tech. Tulane won their last 4, including the American Conference Championship game against UCF, and then put up 46 against USC in the Cotton Bowl. Yeah, this was one that I kind of put down on my initial list. It probably should have been an honorable mention for me. You rarely get an SEC team traveling on the road against a G5 team. Like, this just doesn't happen. And I credit Ole Miss for scheduling this. Ole Miss also plays Georgia Tech, which, I get isn't the strongest of opponents, but at least it's another Power 5 team outside of conference, as we'll get to a little bit later in the show. SEC teams really don't do this. They don't really schedule a lot of games away from home in the non-conference, and they certainly don't schedule a lot of games on the road against G5 opponents. So I'm guessing this game was scheduled 7-8 years ago. It makes sense from a Ole Miss perspective because it's in New Orleans, which I'm sure is a pretty fertile recruiting ground for them. I'm sure a lot of Rebel fans will travel really well. But yeah, 2 high-powered offenses. Ole Miss, where do they fit in the SEC West? Are they in the same tier as Alabama and LSU? Are they more so in the Arkansas, Mississippi State, Auburn tier? First real chance for Ole Miss to kind of test themselves against an 11-win team in Tulane. So definitely a good one for you. Number 4 for me was Florida at Utah. Week 1, this will be Thursday on ESPN, August 31st. This was a game, you remember last year, right? Mm-hmm. The Anthony Richardson hype train started. Florida beat Utah in the Swamp. Cam Rising, I think they were down 3, threw an interception in the end zone. And you were thinking like, oh man, Florida, like Napier could get this going fast. Wow, they have a stud at quarterback. They just beat a top 10 Utah team, coming off a Pac-12 championship game, coming off a Rose Bowl appearance. And Florida then loses to Kentucky. We've talked about Florida ad nauseum on this pod. Doesn't quite end the season the way they thought they were. Utah, all they do is come back steady, solid, beat USC at home during the regular season, beat them in the conference championship game, win the Pac-12, go to their second straight Rose Bowl, and now again, SEC team traveling east. I think this is Florida's first time playing a game like east of Texas in like 30 years. Like they just don't do this. Like SEC teams just don't really do this. So kudos to Florida and Utah for scheduling this. I think if I remember, they scheduled this during the pandemic, so not too long ago. But yeah, Cam Rising back at Utah for his, I think, seventh season. So good for him, collecting AARP here pretty soon. Florida, who takes the first snap at quarterback? We don't know. Billy Napier's had about as bad of an offseason as you could get. But you could all, mitigate that by beating Utah. Like you could go into Salt Lake City. I'm sure there'll be a ton of Gator fans there. It'll be a great atmosphere. It's an actual home game at Utah at Rice Eccles. It's a standalone game, really. It's like I think the Big Ten has a game that night. I think it's Nebraska, Minnesota as well on Thursday.
Mm-hmm.
But like other than that, there's really nothing else happening. So that'll be a huge attention game. And Lucas, like we mentioned earlier, like the Pac-12 needs to win these games. Like we mentioned it with Utah at Baylor. Like Utah can get a win here. Like it's going to be big for the league. It's going to be big for their college football playoff chances. Um, and I'm really intrigued by this one. I mean, if Utah goes out and beats Florida by 40, you'll start to see the Napier on the hot seat stuff, right? If Florida comes out and gets a win, like I think it kind of calms the storm.
Yeah, I had this one in my top 8 as well, and like I said, for a lot of things that you had said too, like we said, both these teams kind of went opposite paths after that week 1 win for Florida last year, and yeah, it like you said, for Utah, can't really afford to lose this game. They shouldn't lose this game, in my opinion. Like they shouldn't have lost the game last year after seeing what Florida actually looked like. Um, Utah returns a lot on both sides of the ball. I think they're going to come out hungry. I don't think they like the way they went out in the Rose Bowl. Cam Rising gets hurt, and then they basically can't do anything offensively against Penn State in that game. They lose their second consecutive Rose Bowl. So I think Utah is always just going to come with a big chip on their shoulder. It's the first time, like you mentioned, they're getting an SEC team in their house. Um, I've never been to Salt Lake, but I know y'all have always said that the atmosphere there is pretty good for
Yeah, it's
games.
good.
It's very, very
Yep.
underrated. So should be awesome, especially with it kicking off on Thursday night. I love those. They've kind of hit on those. Last year we had the backyard brawl and Purdue Penn State on Thursday night last year, and then it's awesome this year. We're going to get another decent Big Ten game, and then this one as well. But yeah, and then who's going to play at quarterback for Florida? Is it going to be Graham Mertz? Is it going to be Jack Miller? Is it going to be someone that's not on the roster currently? We heard Napier said he was going to try to go after another transfer quarterback. Um, I have no idea. I would love to see Graham Mertz light up Utah as a Wisconsin fan. I would love to see it. Not sure it's going to happen, but yeah, I had that one in my top 8 as well. One of many, I think, really intriguing non-conference games that the Pac-12 has scheduled this year.
Yeah, for sure. All right, where do you got next?
So I will stay in the Pac-12. This one was after Tulane, Ole Miss. I had Oregon going on the road at Texas Tech.
Interesting. Okay, not on my list. Go ahead.
Yeah, so Oregon, obviously, really nice year 1 under Dan Lanning. Both of these programs had really nice year 1s under their respective head coaches. Texas Tech went 7-5 in the regular season. They crushed Ole Miss in their bowl game to finish 8-5. There's a lot of positive momentum around Joey McGuire. That was a hire that some people were a little hesitant on because he had no head coaching experience. Or even coordinating experience at the Power 5 level. But I think it's interesting. Tyler Shuck, who's going to be the starting quarterback for Texas Tech, was formally transferred from Oregon to play in Texas. And also want to see what Bo Nix does. Kenny Dillingham isn't there. We know both of his best years as a collegiate athlete was when Dillingham has been his offensive coordinator. How are they going to look like? And once again, like we said, teams in the Pac-12, if they want to go to the playoff, I do not think can afford to lose a non-conference game this year, just because I don't think I just don't see anyone going undefeated in that league. And Lubbock is just one of those other places. Ask Texas about it. It's just it's where usually upsets tend to happen, even if you're the better team. So once again, it's just two teams who I think have a lot of expectations. I think Texas Tech, some people are looking at them as maybe a potential dark horse to finish near the top of the Big 12. Um, and once again, I think this is going to be a fun passing, good quarterbacks, and just a very it'll feel like a very typical like Big 12 type of game.
Yeah, that's what I was going to hit on. I mean, a lot of points going to be scored. Bo Nix coming back to Oregon, I think, was a surprise, and I think it's a really good thing for the Pac-12. It's a good thing for Oregon. It's a good thing for Dan Lanning. A lot of points going to be scored in this one. A lot of plays. It's gonna be really fun.
Mhm.
This wasn't one of the games I had. I think Oregon's just gonna be too good for Texas Tech. I could be wrong. Like you said, it's a tricky place to play, right? Lubbock. It's not an easy place to win. The I have two games left on my list. Both are Pac-12 teams. So the first one I'm going to touch on is Nebraska at Colorado week 2. Um, I'm less intrigued by Colorado at TCU, but what I am intrigued by is first year head coach Matt Rule wanting to do things the right way, wanting to play to tradition and bring the fullback back and like really get with the alumni and the boosters and whatever. And then Dion coming off of what most likely will be a loss to TCU. Like, I don't know. Who knows? Maybe Colorado beats TCU. And then again, it's just off the rails Dion stuff, right? This is week 2. It's probably going to be big noon kickoff. Two huge brands, two former Big 12 kind of rivals. And this is going to be Dion's first home game. I was reading that like the average ticket price is like $400. Like it's going to be a zoo there. It's going to be a great atmosphere, even if it's a 10 a.m. local start. And this will be the first test for Matt Rule in Nebraska. Like I think it's two intriguing teams. Like what do each of these teams look like in year 1, right? Nebraska's probably going to have Jeff Sims at quarterback. They're going to run. I mean, watching the Nebraska spring game, they ran all kinds of offense. They ran under center stuff with the fullback and the I formation. They ran spread stuff, no huddle. And then with Dion, it's Shadur Standard, it's Travis Hunter, it's Cormani McClain. It's a brand new roster. And again, like we're gonna find out really early with Dion in Colorado if this is gonna work. The Pac-12 did Colorado no favors, and Colorado did really itself no favors with this non-conference. Right? You go at TCU week 1, Nebraska week 2. I think you have also Oregon and USC before the middle of October. So we're gonna find out quickly. Like, can you construct a roster with 80% transfers in a year? Or does the Matt Rule approach work? So Colorado's in a couple intriguing non-conference games, but I had this one, I think, number 6 on my list.
Gotcha. Yeah, I did not have this. This one was close to making. I actually had Colorado at TCU, but no, I think I love the way you kind of lined it up because Ryan, I think this is your matchup because you've been a big Matt Rule guy. Last year, you were calling him to Nebraska
A lot
basically
of
at the
stakes
beginning
in
of the
this
year.
one for me.
Yes.
A lot of stakes in this one for me.
And I loved how you set that up. How Matt Rule likes to do things the right way, and then you have Dion on the other side. I wish we forgot to also mention too if you heard Pat Narduzzi's thoughts on Dion, but maybe
Oh
we'll
yeah,
talk about that later. But no, I think yeah, like you said, we're gonna know a lot about Colorado. I mean, they get TCU, who I think is going to be really good again this year. But you mentioned what's the team going to look like? Are they going to have how many players are they even going to have? They still have like what 20-ish scholarship spots that they can still fill.
I think they're around 65 or 70. So I think they're around like 15-ish available
Available
scholarships.
scholarships. Yeah. How? No idea what that roster is even going to look like until fall camp starts. What type of team are they going to be? Are they going to even have an identity by that point? It takes a while to forge that, especially when you have all of these guys coming from have no history being with Colorado or anything like that. And you mentioned kind of that murderer's row for their schedule. If they don't fill all up 85, are they going to have enough depth to really even make it through that type of stretch where you're down to maybe a couple of guys, your last couple of guys at a certain position? But no, I think it'll probably be their second straight big noon kickoff. Probably going to get a lot of that with Dion. And like you said, if they start 0-2, let's say they start 0-2, what if they get their butts whooped in both games? Does the Dion thing start to wear off? Does he kind of cool his stuff? Because I think with Dion, with a lot of people, I don't think we're necessarily put off by maybe the stuff he's doing, but it's how he like represents it or how he discusses these. Like when he's on McAfee laughing when they were talking about cutting players, like you just took a dude's
Yeah,
scholarship
called them
away.
furniture.
Yeah.
Called them furniture. Said we got to move some old furniture to get new furniture.
So
These are kids. These are kids with like families. I'm sorry.
yes,
Go on.
but
You
no,
can do it.
that
You
should
can do
be
it
a
again.
really, really fun game. I'll just add on since we're already talking about Colorado. I had Colorado at TCU, really for a lot of those same things. What are they going to look like? But I think also on TCU's end, I'm interested to see them with Chandler Morris at quarterback. A lot of people said, he won that starting quarterback job last year over Max Duggan. He got hurt in that game at Colorado last season. But you read, I think it was Bruce Feldman did an article on the Athletic about Chandler Morris. Everyone, all the sources within that program said Chandler Morris won that job easily. He was head and shoulders better than Duggan was going into the season. So I'm excited to see them and just see how TCU handles now really high expectations. I don't think they should be expected to go back to the college football playoff, but they're gonna be with Oklahoma, with Texas, and a couple of those other schools to probably be back in the Big 12 championship game. Um, yeah, I'm just excited for that because we know there's just going to be such a big hype train around Dion that I'm all for it. It brings more attention to a program that has been dormant for a long time. But now we can see finally in those first 2 weeks if Dion's able to back any of it up.
Yeah, if they go 2-0, like I am just gonna have such egg on my face. I don't even know if I can show my face on the pod. You might have to do a solo pod if they beat Nebraska and they beat TCU. I don't know what I'll do.
Well,
Can't even think about it.
the week three preview, I'm just here by myself and be like, yeah, Ryan is
Yeah,
taking a leave of absence from the
yeah.
pod for just a little bit, but
I might have to take a self-imposed suspension if they go 2-0 and beat Nebraska and TCU. All right, last game on my list. It's I have it ranked number 7. Washington at Michigan State. Washington, a little bit like Florida State and LSU, I think is going to get a lot of hype. They beat Texas in their bowl game. They won 10 games, and Michael Penix is getting a little bit of draft hype, like a little bit of like, hey, don't forget about Michael Penix kind of hype, right? The transfer from Indiana had a really good first year in Seattle. So intrigued by Washington, right? It's a return game. Washington beat Michigan State last year in Seattle. Washington goes to East Lansing this year. And I think for Michigan State, like that's a program that went to a New Year's Six Bowl in 2021. And last year, wheels fell off a little bit with Mel Tucker. And then Peyton Thorne entered the transfer portal, transferred to Auburn. And Keon Coleman transferred to Florida State. And like Mel Tucker got the big extension right after 2021, and interested to see what Michigan State looks like, right? Can they eke themselves into the Penn State conversation, or are they more in the Indiana Rutgers conversation, right? This will be the last year with Big Ten with divisions. Maybe that's a good thing for them. Maybe it's not. So interested to see what Michigan State looks like year 4 under Mel
yeah, year
Tucker.
4.
And then, Washington, like you win this game big. It's a really good non-conference road win. You go into conference play with some momentum. This game is week 3. So really, like week 3 from my notes has Pitt, West Virginia, Minnesota, North Carolina, and then this one has kind of the marquee games. Week 3 traditionally kind of a down week for non-conference games. That's when the SEC starts play as well. Some conferences get going. So Washington and Michigan State on my list. I think 2 kind of intriguing upper tier Power 5 teams. Michigan State, it's a big year for Mel Tucker, and this could set the tone for that.
Yeah, and like you mentioned too, this was a game last year when Washington absolutely kicked the crap out of Michigan State, and we're like, oh whoa,
Yep.
Washington might be pretty dang good.
I
And
remember betting Michigan State. I bet Michigan State in that game. That was one of my picks. I was like, oh, I don't think I think I was super high on Michigan State last year. I was just complete egg on my face.
yeah, did not work. It was such a fall from grace. I mean, it just showed how good Kenneth Walker was and meant to that team the previous year. And you mentioned Peyton Thorne and Keon Coleman are gone. They also lost Peyton Reed, who went to the NFL, was a third round pick for the Green Bay Packers this year. So no idea what to expect. And the thing was Peyton Thorne and Keon Coleman both left this past spring. They were both penciled in as the starters, started the spring games. So now you're kind of starting from scratch all the way here in fall camp. And I don't know. I don't love the vibes going on at Michigan State with the amount of players that are transferring out. You saw, I think it was a few months ago, Mel Tucker, they fired their director of recruiting, Salid Khalif, um, because they wanted to revamp all of that. It just feels like the stuff that happens the year before a coach has a really, really bad year. And maybe we could be wrong. Maybe they're able to, kind of rally the troops with everything that's, hey, the guys that are here are staying here. And that's why, like you mentioned, that's why I think this game is also high enough, because even if they don't win this game, I think Washington will probably be favored by, I don't know, maybe like over a touchdown, probably on the road at East Lansing. Even if this game is competitive, I think maybe that's something you can build off of if you're Michigan State. Because right now, I mean, my expectation for Michigan State is probably a bowl game is probably a successful season for them with the schedule that they have. So,
And you're paying Mel Tucker a lot of money to go to a bowl game.
yep.
You're paying Mel Tucker a lot of money for 7-5.
Well, and if they go 5-7, that's three. You're paying a guy $8.5 million, and he's had a losing season 3 of his 4 years there. If that happens this season, so
Yeah.
we'll see. Well, and it all starts really with that non-conference game.
Yeah. 100%. Any other non-conference games you had on your list you want to chat before we kind of move on?
I did not. We covered all the ones I have, including
Okay.
my honorable mentions.
So, one of the things that I did in prep for this pod is I went through each Power 5 team schedule and I looked at who are the toughest non-conference schedules and who are the easiest non-conference schedules. So I went kind of conference by conference. And when we look at teams that have really challenging non-conference schedules, right? I'm going to go through conference by conference teams that play at least two Power 5 opponents, right? ACC has 8 of them. 8 of the 14 teams in the now. It's a little wacky because some of those teams play Notre Dame, but listen to some of these schedules. This is just non-conference in the ACC. Clemson plays at South Carolina, also play Notre Dame. Clemson Notre Dame is another one we could have mentioned as well. Notre Dame beat Clemson last year in South Bend. Clemson gets them in Death Valley this year. Florida State, LSU, like we chatted, they also play at Florida end the season. Louisville plays Indiana, Notre Dame, and Kentucky. North Carolina has South Carolina, Minnesota, and then I put Appalachian State as well. Kind of a tough G5 game in addition to 2 Power 5 teams. Pittsburgh plays 3 Power 5 teams in the non-conference. They play Cincinnati, at West Virginia, at Notre Dame. Georgia Tech, just what are you doing, Georgia Tech? At Ole Miss and then hosting Georgia. Georgia Tech plays Georgia every year, and they're like, you know what? Let's go. We want more SEC teams on the schedule. Virginia plays Tennessee in Nashville, which will effectively be a home game for Tennessee, and at Maryland. Virginia Tech plays Purdue, at Rutgers, and at Marshall. Big 12 here, real quick. I'll go through the rest of the leagues, and I'll toss it back to you, Lucas, for some thoughts. Texas Tech at Wyoming, week 1, which is tough, and then Oregon. West Virginia plays at Penn State and Pitt. In the Big 10, Purdue plays at Virginia Tech. They host Syracuse. In the Pac-12, we talked about Washington playing at Michigan State. They also opened with Boise State at home. Boise finished the 2022 season really strong. Utah, weeks 1 and 2, Florida at home at Baylor. Colorado, weeks 1 and 2 at TCU and Nebraska. South Carolina in the SEC. South Carolina plays North Carolina and Clemson. North Carolina is in Charlotte. Clemson is at home in Columbia. And then Florida plays at Utah in addition to their annual crossover with Florida State. Lucas, anything jump out when I mention some of the toughest non-conference schedules?
Yeah, a couple of things. One, I understand the ACC with some of those teams playing too because they only play 8 conference games, so I actually give them credit for
Right.
trying to play at least 10 Power 5 teams a year. Unlike kind of their neighboring conference, I think there's only a couple of like Florida's one of them. I think
There's two.
there's two that
There's two.
play
That
they only play an 8 game conference schedule. The rest is, I mean, just kablooey. Like for example, like I get it, Georgia was supposed to play Oklahoma this year, but because Oklahoma's coming to the SEC, they canceled it. But I mean, UT Martin, Ball State, UAB, and then Georgia Tech um, towards the end. But kudos.
we'll get to the easiest schedules. We will get there,
Yes,
and I will talk about the
yes.
SEC.
But no, just kind of, I think. But if you're a program like West Virginia, look, I'm all for people that want to do tough schedules. It's going to benefit you, I think, way more starting next year when you can have one or 2 or 3 losses potentially in making the playoff. But if you're West Virginia and you've been kind of teetering on bowl eligibility the last 4 of the 5 years, and your head coach is on a massive hot seat this year, can't say I'm sure he was thrilled that he has to play Penn State and Pitt on the same. I mean, going to Happy Valley probably going to be a raucous atmosphere. It's the Saturday night game in early September. And then you have to play Pitt, who had a really nice year under Pat Narduzzi. Actually, obviously beat West Virginia, but then ended up winning 9 games. And then you got to play a pretty tough Big 12 schedule. So I think but then again, then you have, I think you kind of have to balance it. I think if you're some of these programs, like you mentioned, like Georgia Tech, if I had to play Georgia every year, like I would not schedule.
Why?
I would
Yeah.
not.
Why would you schedule any more Power
No,
Five teams in the
no,
non-conference? Why?
no.
I know why now the ACC continues to struggle outside of Clemson, right? You look at what these teams do in the non-conference, like Florida State's playing LSU. If Florida State played, another G5 team there, everybody would understand it, right? You already play Florida every
Mm-hmm.
year, right? North Carolina playing South Carolina, Minnesota, and Appalachian State. Louisville with a first year coach. You play Kentucky every year. You scheduled Indiana and you get Notre Dame, right? Virginia Tech, you're 200 under Brent Pry. You won 3 games last year. You go Purdue at Rutgers and at Marshall. Why is Virginia Tech playing a road game at Marshall? Right? Like we talk about this. Like, why do these ACC teams? We saw it. We see it every year, right? Wake played at Army 2 years
Mm-hmm.
ago, right? Like we've seen all these. Virginia Tech played, I think, at Old Dominion last year, right? Like, why do these
UNC last
AC like
year,
Virginia?
UNC played at App State and at Georgia State last year.
Yeah, right. Virginia plays Tennessee in Nashville, and then plays at Maryland, right? Like it's hard. Like these struggling ACC teams, you're already not that great, and then you play additional. Now I commend these teams. Like I would much rather potentially watch the end of a Virginia Maryland game than like a Virginia versus like Rhode Island game or a Virginia versus like insert FCS team here, right? I appreciate, but that's why you don't see ACC teams other than Clemson making the college football playoff, right? Because it's like Florida State, you don't get rewarded by playing LSU. You just don't. Like in the 4-team era, if you're undefeated, you're going to be in the playoff.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in a Power 5 conference, if you have one loss, it's a pretty good chance. But if you have 2 losses, you're not going to get in over a one-loss conference champion or a one-loss team. You're just not, right? Especially if that team comes from the SEC. So, and one thing that caught my attention was Washington and Florida. I'm sorry, Washington and Utah. These are 2 teams in the Pac-12 that are supposed to be upper echelon teams that are challenging themselves in the non-conference, right? Washington State doesn't have to schedule Boise State. Everyone knows how good Boise is. You could schedule San Jose State. You could schedule Colorado State. You open the season at home against Boise State, then you go at Michigan State. In Utah, in addition to having to play, at USC this year, they have to play UCLA this year. And 9 conference games. They're going to play 11 Power 5 teams, including one on the road in Baylor, who won their conference 2 years
Mhm.
ago. I commend Utah for doing this, but you're just not rewarded in this era of college football.
No. And it's the rare year too that Utah is not playing BYU too. They didn't play them
Right.
last year or this year, but when they get that series, I think that series is supposed to resume next season. Are they going to, does Utah smarten up? Do they schedule another Power Five team that year too? Because I get it, your fan base wants to see you play these games, but at the same time, you're also like, hey, we also want to make sure that we're playing and potentially setting ourselves up for national championships, which right now that's scheduling with our current system you're not. But like we said, maybe starting next year, you'll see some of these teams who schedule like this. Hopefully they get rewarded if they win or maybe drop one of these games. But I guess we'll see.
All right, so easiest non-conference schedules here. And again, we talked about this at the top of the show. If you're talking about if you like to bet college football, right? Like this kind of information might be important as you're looking at early season. If you're looking at win totals here in the month of May, like us, degenerates are. Boston College does not have a Power Five team on their non-conference. They play Northern Illinois, Holy Cross, Army, and UConn all at home. And again, if you're Boston College, like that's music to Jeff Hatley's ears. That is should be 4 wins.
Mm-hmm.
At the very least, you're getting 3 wins, and now all you need are 2 or 3 ACC wins to get to a bowl game. TCU, I put as an easy non-conference schedule. They have Colorado, SMU, and Nichols. Oklahoma, again, like Georgia, had the home and home canceled. Oklahoma has Arkansas State, SMU, and at Tulsa. So no Power 5 teams for Oklahoma. Michigan has East Carolina, UNLV, and Bowling Green, all at home. Second straight year, Michigan does not have a Power 5 non-conference opponent on the schedule. They canceled the home and home with UCLA. They didn't put anything else on the schedule. Really bad for Michigan. I'm sorry. It's just really poor for Michigan. But if the committee's not going to penalize them for that, and if they go undefeated or have one loss and they win the Big Ten, they're in.
Mm-hmm.
So who cares what you play in non-conference? Pac-12, Oregon State, they get at San Jose State, UC Davis, San Diego State, UCLA. Again, was supposed to play Michigan in the home and home. They have at San Diego State, Coastal Carolina, and NC Central. Now we get to the SEC. Georgia, Lucas mentioned the schedule: UT Martin, Ball State, UAB, Georgia Tech. Tennessee gets Virginia in Nashville, which will be basically a home game for Tennessee. They get Austin P, UTSA, and UConn. UTSA might be a little frisky. Like that's a pretty good, I think, Conference USA team.
Yes. Or no, they're in the American this year.
Oh yeah, that's right. They got moved to the American, and Frank Harris is back at quarterback,
yes.
right?
Yes.
So it's kind of interesting, but again, Tennessee. This is a lot of what SEC teams do. They schedule home and homes on a neutral site, right? Like Georgia last year played Oregon in Atlanta. Well, that's a home game for Georgia, right? Alabama for years would play games in Atlanta and Dallas, right, and not do true home and homes. This is how the SEC kind of does things. Ole Miss, Mercer at Tulane, Georgia Tech, UL Monroe, and then Auburn with first-year coach Hugh Freeze, UMass at Cal, Samford, and New Mexico State.
You basically have two FCS teams because UMass is pretty much like an FCS team at this point. But
yeah, and you're playing arguably the worst Pac-12 team in Cal. But again, if you're Auburn, like you play Alabama and Georgia every year.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't blame Auburn for not scheduling a really tough non-conference schedule. You play Alabama and Georgia every year. Why? For Hugh Freeze's first year, this is a perfect first get for Jeff Hatley in kind of a hot seat year, getting Army, getting UConn, and getting Northern Illinois and Holy Cross. Like that's what you want. Michigan, like I don't know what excuse you have. I get that you sell out every game no matter what. I get that you're going to be on ABC or Fox every week no matter what, basically. I just think it's ridiculous that you don't schedule a non-conference Power 5 team.
Yeah.
I just think it's ridiculous. Like why would we not want to see UCLA at Michigan instead of essentially like East Carolina or UNLV at Michigan or Bowling Green at Michigan? It's frustrating.
Yeah. I'm not sure why they gave the reasoning for canceling that. It wasn't because UCLA it wasn't because UCLA was coming to the conference, because it would have ended this year before they joined, so it wouldn't have interfered with any
Right.
future schedules or anything like that. But no, the only thing I can see is maybe they had it scheduled and they were at UCLA this year and they wanted to guarantee that they would get 7 home games, because this year the Big Ten East only gets four of their 9 conference games will be at home. So maybe that was the reasoning, but I have no idea. It's kind of it's annoying, but what do you get? Like you said, they're not going to get punished for it, so they're not going to get cared. They did the same thing last year. I
Yeah.
was going to say another one in the SEC was Kentucky, um, which, like we were talking about, this Kentucky's smart with this. They know who they are and they know what they're trying to do. But obviously, they do play at Louisville to end the year. But before
Yep.
that, they have Ball State, Eastern Kentucky, and Akron. Um, so
Oof.
should be able to get at least three of those four. If
Right.
they're playing well.
Right.
Yeah.
Anything else before we wrap up?
No, but after the news with the Big Ten, was just really really happy to look into games. I'm excited for. I think it's this coming Wednesday. Most of the major networks are going to be announcing all the first 3 weeks. I think it's weeks 1 through 3. They're going to be announcing all of the kickoff times and things like that. So we'll finally have times and to look forward for certain games and what networks. So I'm really, really excited and looking forward to that as the nerd that we both are when it comes to college football, that we're excited to see what network
Right.
and what time they play at. So I'm excited. And once again, too, just signing off, I want to thank everybody who's been listening to us. If you can, please subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple, wherever you listen to your podcasts. And also follow us on Twitter, so we can give you episode updates. You can follow us at running for roses on Twitter. Sometimes I have to catch myself, but someone already had running for the roses apparently on Twitter, so we couldn't use
Gosh dang it.
it.
It's always usually people that have like 7 followers and haven't tweeted in like
Four.
14, like 4
Yeah.
years that you're just like, okay, can I have my name, please? Can I just have my... All right, Lucas, appreciate the time, man. Let's talk to you in a couple weeks, man.
Yeah.
For Lucas Rohde, I'm Ryan Bafaloukos. Thank you for listening to Ryan for the Roses. Have a great night, everyone.